the drawing area, and how the Visibility Graphics Overrides dialog provides customization to each view. Now, each view you create in Revit has its own visibility graphic overrides. This means you can configure each view a little bit differently. This is critical because essentially everything you build in Revit is visible in any model view you create. Now, there are other views such as schedules and 2D views, and we will talk about those a little bit later, but any and all model elements that you place in your model will be visible in any and all model views. So being able to control the visibility of those elements, well, that's an extremely important point. For example, you wouldn't want to see sanitary waste piping in your HVAC plan, right? Or at least that's how we do it in my office. And you may not want to see diffusers and light fixtures in the same reflected ceiling plan. Or maybe that's how you want your ceiling plans to look, but you don't want to see the fire protection system. I mean, whatever your preference is, adjusting the visibility graphics for each view is how you will accomplish it. So let's take a look at the dialog and explore some of the settings. Now you can get to the dialog a couple of different ways. Now I like keyboard shortcuts, so VV is the one for this one. You can also use VG. Of course, since the visibility graphics is a view property, you can get to the dialog from the properties palette as well. The title of the visibility graphic overrides dialog shows you which view these settings are for right up at the top. So any changes I make in this dialog will only affect this view. I hope I've made myself clear because sometimes people have a hard time understanding this point. We're not dealing with separate files of the project. We're actually interacting with the same model elements in different views. Okay, I'm done talking about that. If you don't quite understand that concept, don't worry too much about it. By the end of this course, I'm sure it will make sense. Okay, the dialog has a number of tabs at the top. The first four all involve categories. So there are a number of set categories in Revit, and they are all hard-coded into Revit, which basically means we cannot alter them in any way. We cannot add to them. We can't remove them. We're sort of stuck with the ones that Autodesk has coded in there for us. Now, as you can see, there are different types of categories: model, annotation, analytical, and imported. Now, it's pretty self-explanatory, but the model category tab basically has visibility settings for any of the model categories. Annotation category has visibility settings for annotations, so on and so forth. Now, the filters tab is kind of what you might think. It basically allows you to add filters that will further control the graphics of any of the categories. Now, work sets we haven't spoken about, but it's essentially a collection of elements in a work shared project. Don't get hung up on the jargon at this point. We're going to talk about work sets a little bit later in the course, so make sure you're joining me for that. But the work sets tab lists the work sets that have been created, and you can control the visibility from that tab. I want to demonstrate a little of how altering the settings in this dialog will affect the view. First of all, you can turn off everything in this tab by unchecking this box right here. You don't want to see any model elements in the view, just uncheck it. Notice the entire list turns gray. That's just a visual cue that lets you know that you've shut everything off. Now let's do something fun. I'm going to change a few settings of one of the categories, which will show you how to override the graphics of the categories in the view. Now Revit uses a couple of different lines to graphically display elements. Notice in the dialog we have lines, patterns, and transparency columns under the projection surface header. And we also have lines and patterns column under the cut header. Now, lines and patterns under the projection surface header are those that you would see on the surface or the outside of an element. Lines and patterns under the cut header are those that you would see if you were to, say, section the element and kind of peer inside. Well, certain Revit categories have both projection and cut lines and patterns, but none of the MEP categories do. This is a graphical look that stems from a drafting standard that shows sectioned elements thicker at the cutting point so the reader can read the drawing easier. Now this is pretty much an architectural detailing concept, therefore none of the MEP categories have cut lines or patterns. So let's take a look at the ducts category. Notice lines under the projection surface header is editable, but patterns is not. Well, this means we can alter the lines that represent duct in the view, i.e. make them thicker, smaller, dash them even. But the surface pattern, which is, the bigger part of the duct or the category, something that can distinguish it very easily, well, that's controlled somewhere else. In Revit, we use systems to control the surface patterns so that we can distinguish each individual system. Now, since ducts are part of a system, i.e. supply, return, and exhaust, well, the surface pattern is controlled by the system properties. Now, we can talk about different systems in Revit later on in the course, but for now, let's change the projection lines for the duct category to something ridiculous so you can see how the changes affect the category in the view. I'm going to set the weight to 13 and the color to magenta and click OK to close the dialog, then OK to close the VG dialog. Now notice how the lines are ridiculously thick and the color is magenta, just like we set. Now remember, this only affects the view that we're in. So if I open a different view, the duct will seem normal. Now to get it back to a normal setting, all I have to do is clear the overrides and then click OK to get all the way out. Now you may be asking yourself, what if I want to make that change to all my views and not just this one? Well, you can do that by clicking on the Object Styles button at the bottom of the dialog. This button opens a new dialog that looks similar to the VG dialog with the added material column. These settings are global, so changing a setting in this dialog will change the category for all views. So you want to consider carefully before you make a change here. Understand your office standards before doing so. Remember when I said that you could only change the surface pattern of a category through its system? Well, filters provide a way to override elements or categories that share common properties. In this case, the name of the system classification is the common property for all the categories using this filter. So if I select this duct and look at its properties, you'll notice that supply is the system classification name. And that overrides the graphics for all the categories that make up this system. So like I said earlier, we're going to talk more about work sets later in the course. Work sets relate to a specific workflow that will make more sense when I get to that part in the course. We're nearly finished talking about the user interface, so be sure to join me in the next video for the last two parts of the user